Hello everyone, and welcome to the second SEB Christmas lecture of 2020. And welcome back anyone who was also here for yesterday's talk. And for anyone who's new to us or is joining an SEB event for the first time, welcome as well. Just as a bit of background for anyone who is new to the SEB, we're a member organisation for animal, plant and cell biologists. And as part of our wider aims, we aim to promote the importance and impact of biological research, and also to bring people together to share and discuss ideas. And that was part of the rationale behind this new themed lecture series that we've just launched, starting with Christmas, but that will run across 2021. And the idea is that no matter your background, whether you're an expert in the field or if you've just got a general interest in the topic, you'll be able to access these webinars and learn something new, and that's perhaps something slightly outside of your usual remit. So do keep an eye out on our website and also social media for future events, but also for other events that we run across the year, from our annual conference, but also smaller satellite meetings and symposium and career building events. With that out the way, I'll introduce today's speaker, Dr. Andrew Derocher. So Andrew is a leading polar bear researcher with 37 years experience of field research studying polar bears across the Canadian Arctic, Western Russia and Svalbard. And I guess having travelled fairly extensively throughout his career, he's currently based back in Canada, where he's Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. Unfortunately, we're probably all quite familiar with images of polar bears floating on sea ice, as they've kind of become a cover image for climate change. And that's what Andrew will be speaking to us about now with his talk, Apex Predators in Peril, Polar Bears in a Warming Arctic.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that introduction. Today's talk is going to be fairly broad overview about some of the research I've been involved in. Rather than diving into specific studies, I'm just trying to give an overview of what we know about polar bears and how they fit in this ecosystem and some of the challenges that are facing them going forward. So I'll give you a bit of insight anyways as to what I do. And in that sense, I'm just going to touch a little bit on the natural history and evolution of polar bears and a little bit about how we study them. As you heard, I've been doing this for a long time and we're still active in the field. Our field work in 2020 was canceled, of course, due to COVID, and we're not allowed into the Arctic right now because the small communities are quite vulnerable. I'm going to touch on threats, and while I've done a fair bit of work studying things like ecotoxicology and happy to talk about those towards the end, if people have questions, it's not the focus of today's talk. But I think to put this in context, polar bears are a species of the sea ice. They're what we call a pagophilic or ice-loving species. It is the primary habitat where they spend most of their life. It's the surface over which they travel. It's the surface where they do most of their hunting. They mate on the sea ice. And in some parts of the Arctic, we actually have polar bears denning out on the sea ice. And these would be pregnant females that will overwinter on the drifting ice, give birth to their cubs. In most areas, females actually come on shore to give birth to their cubs. But in some parts of the Arctic, we have bears that were born on the sea ice, live their entire life on the ice, and never have any reason to step on shore. Of course, one of the things we're quite familiar with is a lot of people see pictures of polar bears on land, but that's not really where they want to be. So this is a species that's highly adapted to really live where sea ice persists for most of the year. And that word most is one of the biggest challenges from a conservation biology perspective. And it's actually one of the areas that we are addressing in my research group. So I'll talk a bit about some of our research methods, but a lot of it is satellite telemetry work to look at sea ice dynamics and how the bears are making a living in this sea ice environment as it is rapidly changing. So just to set the context, this is Melville Island in the high Canadian Arctic where we were studying polar bears. Nice habitat, a little rough ice along the shore, very low density polar bears in this area. This is on the western end of the Northwest Passage. So we're quite high latitude up here. Sea ice as a habitat is incredibly variable, and it's a quite foreign place for most people. So if you go to an environment like this, one of the first things you'd think is it's relatively sterile. There's not much here. Of course, that's because it is a marine ecosystem. The bears just happen to live on top of this thin film of sea ice, which is actually quite dynamic. And this is another study area. This is actually in Hudson Bay, where we are currently working out on the sea ice. This is challenging conditions because, of course, helicopters don't float, and we use a helicopter to access these areas, and of course, allowing us access to the bears. So in the context of a sea ice food web, we're going to focus on polar bears today, but of course, it's probably not at all what we would consider a keystone species in this ecosystem. Probably that little funny, ugly cod down in the middle there, the polar cod, which is quite small, varying up to several inches long. That is probably the keystone species in this ecosystem. But one of the things that most of these species on this little illustration have is that they are ice-dependent species. So we have a whole ecosystem that is really centered around the presence of sea ice. And if you take away the sea ice, you end up with a very different ecosystem, and one that is increasingly, as we're seeing sea ice diminish in the Arctic, dominated by different species of fish, and in particular, killer whales are moving into the Arctic in quite high numbers. So to put this in context, and I think because most people aren't that familiar with sea ice ecosystems, the way I like to think about it is most of us are familiar with terrestrial ecosystems, and you can think about plants and soil as sort of being the basis of a marine or a terrestrial system. But in the marine world, you have to think about sea ice more in the context as it's almost like the soil of an ecosystem. It is the substrate under which there's a whole living community. And because the way sea ice forms, there's actually these small brine channels that form. And inside there, we have bacteria and viruses and fungi and a whole ecosystem that sustains the next trophic level, which is, of course, the invertebrates, and then up into the polar cod. But some recent work that's been done looking at the diet of polar bears, they actually found that following tracers, about 72 to 100% of the diet, marine diet of polar bears, is actually coming from these ice-associated algae. So it's fairly clear to say that that is the base of the food chain for these animals. It's not pelagic open water algae that is really dominating this system. It's this under ice ecosystem that really dominates this. And then, of course, there's an amazing association of animals that then feed on this and then prey on each other, and very quickly move into polar cod, or Borregatus seda is the genus species. And one of the things about this species is that it requires sea ice for its eggs to successfully develop. And having been through various parts of the Arctic and in icebreakers, doing our research, whenever you knock over an ice floe, two things are eminently clear in the springtime. Number one is that they're brown underneath, or browny green color from ice algae. And then you also flip over these ice chunks and there's just hundreds and thousands of these small polar cod underneath the ice. So in this context, this is what I call the big meal deal and the small meal deal. The ring seal is the small meal deal. This is the sort of bread and butter of polar bears. Ring seals are up to about 70 kilos in mass at maturation. Bearded seals, the big meal, they're up to about over 400 kilos. Ring seals number in the millions across the circumpolar Arctic. They're absolutely everywhere. Bearded seals are much less common, but one of the important things is this is where polar bears make their living. These two species, and predominantly it's ring seals, usually make up at least 60% of the diet of the bears. But the important thing is that both of these prey species depend upon sea ice to complete their life histories, and in particular for reproduction, for producing their pups, but also for the whole process of molting. So again, this is an ecosystem that really does depend on the presence of sea ice. So just to give a bit of a sense here, what happens in a polar bear's world is these ring seals, they give birth to their pups under a snowdrift, and then in the springtime, this is when the bears are hyperphagic. So the bears have a very small window of time to prey on seals and deposit a very large fat store so that they can fast through the summer period. So a lot of their olfactory predators, and they are coming into these areas. This is a snow lair that a ring seal mother has built. She had a pup in underneath here, and then polar bears, as an olfactory predator, can smell them under the snow, and then their job is to sort of crash through the snow cover along these pressure ridges in the ice, and then they can, if they can close off that exit hole, then they will have access to the pup, and they pull them out. And this is what I call the equivalent of a bad sandwich. You know, if you were a kid and you had a crappy sandwich that your parents gave you, you took one bite and you threw it away. And that's actually what happened in this context, is that a polar bear caught this newborn ring seal pup. The problem is it was just born and it's so skinny that there's no real point in finishing any more of it. So it took one bite and then moved along and went hunting for something else. So in this context, this is really a much better sort of meal for polar bear. This is, again, a young bearded seal. And these are what I sometimes call banana seals. They peel them open because what they're not really interested in is eating the meat of these seals. And this next slide shows it quite nicely. This is an adult ring seal that's been fed on by a polar bear. And what they do is they basically open them up and they peel them back, and then they're scraping off the fat from these seals. So it's almost like a form of optimal foraging. They really want that very, very high energy part of the seals. They're not that interested in eating the meat. So it's how they actually make their living. That's what makes it possible to be a polar bear in the Arctic. And the estimates we have is that a bear, given a seal, they can eat about 10 to 20% of their mass in a single meal. So in this context, if we think that a big adult male polar bear can easily be in the 500 kilogram range, that means that they're taking in about 50 to 100 kilograms of seal fat in a single meal. And the assimilation efficiency of that is well over 90%. So it goes almost unmodified from their digestive system into their adipocytes, and they basically just swell these up as a huge amount of energy for storage. And for context, for those of you that might be getting hungry in the evening, not that I'm advocating for this brand, but it's about the size of one of these Big Mac meals that some people eat. So this is not a polar bear, but this is the ancestral polar bear. So to touch on a few of the adaptations and where this species has come from, it took somewhere between 500,000 to perhaps 5 million years. It's hard to say exactly, but we went from a brown terrestrial omnivore to a white marine carnivore over that period. And the bears have adapted incredibly well to this new environment. And part of the reason that we've got this wide range on the evolutionary time is because we have had back crossing between these two species, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. I won't go through all the adaptations and separation between these two species, but they're numerous. They exist in the dentition. Polar bear dentition has gone back to being more carnivorous. Brown bear dentition is much more omnivorous, reflecting their diet. The polar bear skull is more elongated. The eyes have actually moved somewhat up on the skull as well. The skull is longer, probably associated with increased need for olfaction and pre-warming of air, living in a cold environment. Down at the base of the animal, the claws are incredibly different. Polar bears have a much more predatory type of claw. The brown bear or grizzly bear has a claw that's really designed for excavation, which is what they use them for. Of course, the fur on the feet of polar bears provides excellent traction on the sea ice, but also keeps their feet warm. And one of the major differences that you don't really see here is that if you went in the Arctic right now, anywhere in the north, you would find polar bears actively hunting, seeking seals, trying to feed. It's not really the prime hunting season now. That will happen in the spring, but you will not be able to find a brown bear, grizzly bear anywhere because they hibernate over winter. So one of the big distinctions between these two species is that the brown bear makes their living in the summer, spring and summer, and polar bears make their living in the spring alone. So it's a very different sort of lifestyle that these two species live. They have some things in common. They've diverged quite a bit. This little tiny cub that's down at the rear of the mother, the one with the milky mustache there, that one is actually feeding on a pair of mammary glands that polar bears no longer have. So the brown bears have 6 functional mammae. Polar bears have dropped down to only having 4 functional mammae, the one on their chest. And again, this refers to the fact that they typically only have 1 or 2 cubs. And so it's a shift, and it probably is a reflection of the challenges of rearing offspring in a very difficult environment. One thing both species have in common is they keep their cubs a long time, 2.5 years to weaning. So the mother's in the middle here. She's wearing one of our satellite collars, and these cubs are just coming up to their just about 2 years of age. It's quite interesting, but they'll actually be nursing right out to 2.5 years of age when they're weaned. It's kind of unusual, but you can actually have a male cub that's bigger than its mother will still be trying to nurse. Now, nutritionally, they're not getting very much at that stage, but it does maintain the family bonding section. So in terms of size, adult male polar bears can easily go up to about 800 kilos. This guy's probably much more in the 400 kilo. Much of that last addition is actually body fat. So they just turn very round when they're feeding. This is late, just before they're moving back out onto the sea ice. Females, if pregnant, can get up into 400 kilo range, a little bit more. But one of the things I'm going to try to point out in this talk is that polar bears and brown bears live very different lives. I have worked also on Arctic brown bears in Canada, and they are absolutely tiny in comparison to polar bears. And that just reflects a very different nutritional plane that these two species live on. So both of these species have in common a very long lifespan, females up to about 28 years, and males rarely making it to about into sort of the mid-20s. Again, as you can see in this guy, this is a big old adult male in declining condition. They do tend to fade in body condition after about 16, 17 years of age. It's probably the wear and tear of mating activity that really brings them down. And then they pass away in that mid-20s. So again, comparing these two species, brown bears have a home range in the Arctic of about 1,000 square kilometers. So that would be about 1/300th of the UK and Ireland. So in contrast, though, one of the big differences is that polar bears have home ranges easily of 200,000 square kilometers, which would be about 2/3 of the United Kingdom, Ireland. So, and this is actually not at all a large home range. We have polar bears that easily move over 400, 500,000 square kilometers in a single year. These animals show high fidelity to come back to the same areas over time. So despite this large home range, we can find bears moving over thousands of kilometers, and yet they will come back to almost exactly the same spot year over year So they definitely know where they are out on the sea ice. Now I'm just throwing this in because every talk I ever give, somebody's going to have to ask me about growler bears or pisleys, about these famous hybrids that were documented in the Canadian Arctic. I took this picture. This is a grizzly bear that's way up in the Northwest Passage near Banks Island, out on the sea ice, where we were actually looking to work on polar bears. That's what we were doing. So this, just to put where we were, it was kind of interesting to find a grizzly bear up there. They've been sighted in the area. We actually eventually caught that bear. We had permits to do that because we knew they were in the area. And this is just some context. This is what happens when a polar bear meets a grizzly bear. And this is a hybrid. It's a half polar bear, half grizzly bear. And what you don't see in this photo is that she's actually being followed by a grizzly bear. The one that we caught was 100% grizzly bear, but they have fertile hybrids and they can back cross to either parent. And that just reflects the close evolutionary time between them, despite these many different adaptations of living in this environment. So she's being chased by a male grizzly. It's the breeding season. The following year, she was caught by one of my former PhD students. This is what she was with. She had 3 little cubs that now are 3/4 grizzly bear, 1/4 polar bear. We don't know much about how these cubs live. We have some evidence that they live a more terrestrial life, despite the fact that their mother probably is trying to teach them how to be a polar bear. Because all of the hybrids have been with a female polar bear and a male grizzly bear. So one of the things I'm going to try to argue in this talk is that we're not going to undo the evolution that we've seen. So quite often I get pushback from people saying, well, polar bears will just adapt to being on land. They'll thrive in an environment like that. I mean, we see that they can eat all these terrestrial resources. They can eat birds' eggs and sometimes kill reindeer and all these things. The problem is there already is an Arctic terrestrial bear, and that is the barren ground grizzly bear. Polar bears can feed on terrestrial resources because they have access to the marine resources, but enough of their life histories have diverged that we don't see polar bears existing anywhere where we don't have sufficient sea ice. And for context, of course, historically, if we go back, or prehistorically, if we go back in time, we had polar bears all through the Baltic Sea. They came down to Ireland. That's where actually we have a known hybridization event with brown bears. But of course, that was during cold periods when polar bears moved south with the sea ice, but they didn't stay in those areas. They didn't become terrestrial. They no longer live in Sweden. Even though if you get into the Baltic, we still have population of ring seals, we still have sea ice, it doesn't persist long enough for the bears to live there. So where do polar bears live? This is the distribution of the bears from the top down. The higher density areas are associated with continental shelf. So this is really where polar bears live. It's in the shallow waters, less than 200 meters deep. It's where marine productivity is high, seal abundance is high, and so this is where they make their living. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that this is also a species with a huge latitudinal range. So for context, we have polar bears in James Bay at the southern extent of Hudson Bay that are at the same latitude as London. Of course, it's an Arctic environment. The sea there is frozen at this time. It was just freezing. And it's a very different sort of environment in these areas. But again, it reflects that when we're looking at the effects of climate change, we have very many different populations. We actually have 19 of them across the circumpolar Arctic, and we're seeing changes in sea ice conditions that vary across their distribution. So it's very different if we're looking at the southern populations versus the northern ones. The one that is actually right at the top there in the middle is the Arctic Basin. That's never going to be very good polar bear habitat, because as you can sort of see from the bathymetry image underneath there, it's incredibly deep water, it's incredibly unproductive. It's not going to be much of a refuge for polar bears. So we have concerns going forward in time about where polar bears will be. We think they will persist out to the end of this century, but probably just in the very high reaches of the Canadian archipelago and northern parts of Greenland. But the Arctic basin is not where we would expect to see them. Now, for global abundance, we still have lots of polar bears. When we talk about the threats to this species, this is not something that we're talking about in the short term. Our conservation assessments are based under the IUCN Red List protocols. It works with 3-generation rule. So for polar bears, about 36 years. But we do have grave concerns about some populations. And we do have documented declines of over 30 to 40% in at least 3 of the populations in the Arctic. So they're still abundant at this time, but it's our concerns going forward. So as a polar bear scientist, I've been doing this for a long time. It's interesting work. We get to live in these exotic locations. For some reason, all of our conferences are almost always somewhere cold and north, but this is where we work. This is a small research cabin. The nice thing is we get our own helicopter. This was kind of an unusual event. We actually were up on the northern end of Banks Island where it should be -20. It was raining on this day. That's why the helicopter was covered up. It doesn't help our polar bear work at all in these sorts of conditions. Luxurious living conditions with all the modern conveniences, things like heat, a little bit of light from a generator, but pretty basic, but functional. Amazingly beautiful places to work. This is again in the high Arctic. We can immobilize polar bears. They're relatively easy to catch. I'm actually more concerned usually about helicopters than I am about polar bears, but maybe it's misplaced confidence. But the nice thing is they're relatively easy to catch, very robust to capture. We can catch them when they're this age. This is about a 3-month-old cub with its mother. Its mother is asleep. The cubs sometimes run away, and in this case, I had to go run down the cub. Now that I'm a little bit older, I usually get my graduate students to do this. But the nice thing is we can follow these individuals over time, and we can follow them throughout their life. This bear was actually caught the first time when it was actually the size of that small one in the previous slide. So we have this long history of the bears. In one of our study populations in Hudson Bay, we actually have a pedigree that goes back over 4 generations and contains over 3,500 polar bears in it, all genetically typed. So we can start to work with questions of pedigree and the effects, sort of an evolutionary perspective of what's changing in these populations. We also have a lot of morphometric information on these bears that are all standardized. It's interesting, when I first started studying polar bears in Western Hudson Bay, those bears were longer. An adult female has shrunk by at least 10% in body length, just reflecting some of the challenges in the changing environments in which they live. So we use satellite telemetry on our bears. This is a female with 2 8-month-old cubs in this photo. This was in a year in Western Hudson Bay when the bears were in very poor condition. The ice melted early. And she is run out of her fat stores. You can see her hip bones are starting to protrude. The cubs are skinny. The cubs have very little stored fat of their own. They should be nursing at this time, but I watched her over a period of several days and never saw her nursing those cubs. I'm quite certain that she had stopped lactating at this point. So this is just the sort of data that we work with a lot in my research group. This is tracking data from polar bears in Western Hudson Bay. Here the bears are on land, which is where we deploy the collars. And we're now into sort of October, November. The bears start a northward migration as the sea ice forms, quickly get out onto the sea ice, and then spend the whole winter out in this area. hunting seals, mainly ring seals in this area, but bearded seals. And as the climate has warmed, we're also starting to see more harbor seals showing up in this ecosystem and showing up in the diet of the bears. So again, moving over an area, it's 800 kilometers side to side. And then we're now into April. The ice is just going to start breaking up, and the bears are going to be out there as long as they can, trying to add as much body fat. And our studies show very clearly that if a bear stays out longer, they are in better condition and they have better reproductive success as well. So eventually the bears all get back more or less to where they want to be to spend the summer. So in that context, that's some of the data that we work with in my lab. But what makes polar bears so vulnerable to climate change? And it's a pretty simple story. And if you don't get too much more out of this talk, then it's simply a habitat loss issue for the bears. And what we're seeing is that as the Arctic is warming, which is doing about 2 to 3 times faster than more temperate mid-latitude areas, the sea ice is changing. So there are several different threats to polar bears, and most of you might be sort of familiar with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but in a polar bear context, the threats to the bears are hunting, pollution, disease and parasites, and climate change. I'm only going to touch on climate change today. Hunting itself is not really a major threat, but there is subsistence hunting in parts of Russia, Alaska, and Canada and Greenland. Pollution is an ongoing threat. I conservatively estimate that there's probably at least 500, maybe as many as 1,000 different chemicals of anthropogenic origin in your average polar bear. Disease and parasites is not something we know very much about for polar bears, but it is an ongoing concern, especially with warming and new species. So climate change is really the issue that we're going to look at here. When I started working on polar bears, this is what sea ice looked like in September at its minimum distribution. So this is, once it is all melted out, most areas, you could stand on the shores in northern Canada and there would be sea ice and the bears would be there. In the minimum ice cover year in 2012, this is what the Arctic sea ice looked like. And we came very close to that last year, and most years now we are seeing massive reductions in sea ice conditions. And so we have, like in this area off of Alaska and northwestern Canada and the Beaufort Sea, at the bottom part of the screen, what you can see is this ice now has retreated dramatically from where it used to be. And in this area, the continental shelf is very narrow. So the bears normally back in the 80s and early 90s would spend all summer over the continental shelf, but now they're forced to move. If they're going to go with the ice retreating northward, they're moving at least 1,000 kilometers northwards in a straight line. And then to hunt, as the sea ice reforms, they have to move that distance back south. From an energetics perspective, I know that if I had to walk an extra 2,000 kilometers or more per year, I'd probably lose a lot of body mass or require more energy intake. And so that's really where it is at for polar bears. It really is the survival of the fattest. And in this context, you sort of get the sense that bears can be incredibly fat. No bear ever looked at their reflection in a pool of water and thought, I'm too fat. They really are just almost like eating machines. In the springtime, when seals are abundant, that is what they do. It's also the mating season, but they really are dedicated to putting on this body mass, because during this ice-free period, which can be quite extended, the bears are using up almost 1 kilo, about 0.85 for an adult, and about a little over 1 kilo of body mass per day when they're on land fasting. So this is sort of the structure of how climate change and polar bears are interacting. And first thing we get is the warming that alters the sea ice. This really means that the bears have less access to their food. It results in increased movements, and it's increasing the fasting period. Now, bears are incredibly well evolved and adapted to deal with long fasts. And indeed, in some parts of the Arctic, a pregnant female polar bear can go up to 8 months without food, but they come ashore absolutely obese. And they bring enough fat to persist through that period. But other age classes of bears have nowhere near that sort of reserve. And once we cross about 160 to 180 days of sea ice loss, this longer fast results in mortality. And this is the net effect is that altered sea ice has lowered body condition. We're seeing this in many populations. It results in higher mortality, fewer successful pregnancies, and ultimately we end up with a population decline. And like I mentioned earlier, we have seen documented declines in 3 of the 19 populations. The problem we've got, though, is that many of the populations, all the populations in Russia, we have no temporal trends on abundance, very little monitoring going on in many of the populations. That's not to say that all polar bear populations are declining at this time, and we actually have some that are doing reasonably well given the changing ice conditions, but we believe it's a matter of time before things will change in that context. So to sort of get to the end of this, as the sea ice declines, if there's no sea ice, there's no ice bear. And that's an important sort of perspective. Our best analyses suggest that the species should persist to the end of the century, but it really comes down to the solution of reducing greenhouse gas production on a global basis. And then eventually, perhaps over thousands of years, as the planet rebalances, we should hopefully have a kernel of wild bears in the very high reaches of the Arctic that could then move south again and recolonize where they live. So in a nutshell, that is polar bears. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew, for that talk. It was really incredible hearing about some of your experiences researching those beautiful animals. And it was certainly eye-opening to hear about some of the challenges they're facing as well. As you mentioned, yeah, we'll open up to questions now. So if you do have a question, if you just use the raise hand function, then one of the SEB staff can unmute you for you to ask your question. Or if you don't have a microphone or a quiet enough background, then also feel free to type a question in the chat and I can ask it on your behalf. I think we do already have a question here, so I think we've got a couple here. Okay, I'll just unmute. Yes, Neil.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. That was a fantastic talk with some amazing slides. I don't know how you managed to get the photographs, given that you presumably can't approach so close. But my actual question was to do with the movements of the bears. I mean, I'm amazed at how big a distance they can travel, and I just wonder how they navigate. Do they seem to know how to get back to their denning place, even though they've gone, you know, hundreds of miles out onto the sea ice?
It's one of the big mysteries, and you know, we don't know very much about how they navigate, because of course you have to imagine that this is a featureless environment that is constantly moving. I mean, it's a bizarre sense, but you have to think that the substrate on which they live is also moving perhaps at times 15 kilometers a day, just on drift and currents and winds. I suspect it's a large part solar navigation using position of the sun and stars. We don't have much insight on any form of magnetic navigation, but you have to remember that these are also animals that live right around the magnetic pole. So a magnetic compass is probably not the most useful. And so my guess is it has to be more celestial navigation based on the sun. But again, you see in that slide, they show back up on the same area. And then, I mean, I have caught, particularly the big males are notorious for this. They will come back and sit in exactly the same little crater that they'll create on the shore year over year. So it's one of the reasons I think I probably have never lost my fascination for these critters. But the navigation thing is a bit of a mystery.
Thank you. We've got another question here from Sandy, who says, how many bears are you able to monitor? I guess individual bears, and have you known some of them for many years at a time?
Yeah, we normally, our normal sort of project protocol is that we're collaring. So adult females are the only ones that wear collars because they're at mature size. We deploy between 10 and 15 collars per year on adult females. And we have another project for shorter term monitoring on adult males and the subadults, where we put a small satellite transmitter in their ear. They're not as long lasting, small batteries, but we try to maintain somewhere around 10 to 20 with the ear tags. We deploy those in the fall and we deploy them in the springtime, so we can get information on other segments of the population. The bears just all have a number and a letter. We have an international convention, so all bears in Canada that are caught, their first letter is an X. When I worked in Norway, they all started with an N. I don't know why Canada got an X, but every bear has their own individual ID that's on an ear tag put in them. In case they're harvested by an Inuit hunter, we can get the information that they were shot, and also a lip tattoo. Individuals, I mean, it's interesting, you know, we don't really know each individual. I mean, conservatively, I've caught over 5,000 polar bears in my career. Some of them we follow for long periods of time by satellite telemetry, but most of our work is cross-sectional population data. Now I try to focus more on following bears individually with the satellite telemetry data, so we can see how, for example, their habitat use and movement varies as their reproductive states change. So when they're solitary and breeding, when they're with small cubs, and then when they're with 1-year-old or 2-year-old cubs. So in that context, we do have some individuals, we actually are catching the great granddaughters of bears that I caught when I started now. So it's really quite interesting. We have a big, what we call our polar bear Bible. We take it out in the field, and it's this big thick book of all the captures of every single bear. And we can open it up and say, oh, I remember her mother and we caught her this date and this place. And then, oh, she was a cub of, and so you can sort of go back. So it's really quite remarkable. We work closely with federal government scientists with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And together, we have sort of maintained this long-term monitoring of movements and population condition, so.
Thank you. Oh, we've got quite a few coming in. Nikki has got her hands up.
Hi, Andrew. Great talk. I really enjoyed that. I was just wondering whether you had noticed any offspring sex ratio biases as a result of the population declines, whether that's potentially a primary sex ratio bias or a change in survivorship of the offspring.
One of my colleagues with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Nick Lunn, is the primary on the reproductive characteristics, and he is working on a 30-year data set or 40-year data set now, looking at that more recently. I looked at a lot of that work in the early 80s and 90s. There is differential mortality. Males tend to have we start to see sexual dimorphism showing up very early in the offspring when they're dependent on the mother. And one of the consequences of that higher growth rate is it does look that males are more susceptible to mortality in those periods of time when food stress becomes an issue. The populations in Canada, for the most part, are very heavily skewed towards females. So we have far, far more females, but that's largely associated with a sex-related harvest bias, where almost 70% of the bears that are harvested are male. So we tend to shift our populations very strongly towards this female bias. But during the dependency period, they're born close to 50-50, but that work needs more analysis, and that's Nick Lunn's bailiwick right now. So we should be seeing that coming soon. I know he's been working on it for quite a while.
It'll be interesting to hear some of his work on that then. I've got a few in the chat as well. One question I also wanted to ask this actually. Why with the hybrids, is it always a female polar bear and a male grizzly bear? Is it to do with typical territory overlap or biological compatibility?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting story. We don't know why the brown bears have moved so far north in the Canadian Arctic. The one theory is that, of course, with warming, the conditions are just better for brown bears to move northwards. And in any grizzly bear or brown bear population, it's the males that disperse. And so what we're seeing is a male bias dispersal into these areas. And of course, these males are getting into areas where there are no female brown bears. And of course, we all know love is blind. And in the Arctic, it's dark in the springtime at night, I guess. And I think what happens is there's female polar bears in the area. They're moving into estrus. Male grizzly bears, they quite often go out onto the sea ice, crossing these fjords. And of course, cross the tracks of a female in estrus. And then, well, what happens next is pretty well known. And again, it's the idea, it's this early dispersal. We might be seeing brown bears moving into these areas. It could be because harvest pressure has also been reduced in some of these areas. Not as many Inuit are out on the land traditionally as they used to. Many of my Inuit friends are not very fond of having grizzly bears around because they tend to destroy cabins and food caches. So there historically would have been a much heavier harvest pressure on brown bears. So it's a little hard to tell if it's a climate change or a population dynamic shift, but in essence, that's kind of in a nutshell.
It was really interesting seeing that part of your talk and the pictures of the hybrid bear, which looks very similar to a polar bear to an untrained eye with the brown cubs. So it's, yeah, an interesting image to see there.
Yeah, when you see those hybrids up close, and I've seen some a harvester in one of the towns called us down. He had shot, the mother was a polar bear and she had two hybrid cubs. One looked more like a polar bear, one looked a little more like a grizzly bear, but the claws were intermediate. They tend to get these funny sunglasses around their eyes and a little bit of brown in various spots in their extremities. So they're kind of a little bit like mom and a little bit like dad.
It's interesting. If a hybrid bear were to then breed with one or the other of like pure breeds, do you see in future generations any of those characteristics of the opposite bear coming out again or does it sort of just dilute it and eventually disappear?
Well, you know, it's interesting because we have had prehistoric hybridization events. We have very strong evidence of a hybridization event in Ireland. I think it was about 110,000 years ago when brown bears lived there and polar bears came south. The polar bears left with genetic material from that event. We have had another event off the coast of Alaska, off what's called the ABC Islands. And those islands had a population of polar bears at one time during a very cold period. And then what happened as the warming came, brown bears recolonized that area. And the brown bears that live in that area now have polar bear genes in them. They tend to be very large bears, but there's this remnant element of polar bears in there, but you would never see any characteristic visually of them. And this is one of the interesting things. People say, well, won't we just get this hybrid that's now marvelously well adapted? One of the differences we've got is the gene pool of polar bears is tiny. So a polar bear caught in Svalbard in Norway is genetically very, very similar. We could differentiate them with enough loci, but it's very similar to a polar bear anywhere in Alaska. So despite that difference, it reflects that it's a relatively young species, a very small gene pool. But brown bears, you have to remember, I mean, they live in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, historically found as far south as Mexico, the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. So this is a species that has this massively huge diverse genetic material. And the genetic pool would just flood polar bears over time. If these hybridization events occurred enough, polar bears would just be a blip on the evolution of brown bears, that nothing would really change for them.
Thank you. We've got another question here from Ella.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. This is Ella Król from Aberdeen. It was absolutely fascinating talk. I just wonder if you have some insights in physiology. So you mentioned when polar bears are well adapted to fasting or starving, you know, in summer. I guess they would need high metabolic rate and normal kind of body temperature to lactate. But somewhere in the brown bear genes, there are perhaps, you know, a reminder of hibernation, which would, of course, in summer could be used as an estivation to save energy when you have female which is currently not lactating or male. So I just wonder if you have any, you know, body temperature or metabolic data suggesting that they are now being exposed to longer periods of starvation, change they, you know, adapting in terms of physiological mechanisms.
We have some work on that, and some of my Alaskan colleagues have been doing some more recent work. We worked many years ago with a physiologist, Ralph Nelson from University of Illinois, who was working on black bears and their hibernation physiology. And one of the markers was the ratio of serum urea to creatinine. And one of the things you can see is that in a hibernating brown bear or black bear is once you get down to about a 10 ratio or below, the animals are in this non-feeding physiological state. And polar bears regularly during the on-land period when they're not feeding, they drop down into this very low ratio as well, indicative of fasting physiology. There's been some very interesting work that's been done by others. I've done a little bit of work on serum urea creatinine. And one of the interesting things is that the bears can recycle protein back into essential amino acids. So there's some physiological adaptations that the bears have evolved, and we can see this in black bears and grizzly bears that hibernate over winter as well. And I mean, one of the things that's amazing about these animals, you think that a female goes into a den and she's going to be there for 8 months, and these are tiny. I mean, you can't stand up, you can turn around, and that's about it. She'll be in there for 8 months. An average female could easily lose 200 kilos of body mass, but she'll come out of that den with her bone mass largely intact, her muscle mass largely intact, and be totally mobile. I mean, you put me in a hospital bed for a month without moving, and you know, humans fall apart over that time scale. So there are several things, and we think there's some discussion still in the literature as to whether or not the term walking hibernation applies to polar bears. The more recent work suggests from the Alaskans that no, it's a misnomer, that they're not really hibernating in the true sense, but they are doing some things physiologically that are helping to preserve aspects of their internal anatomy, bone mass and protein mass, while they are active. I mean, during the summer, the bears don't do much. They really become incredibly lethargic. There is some evidence that some bears will, over longer periods, drop their body temperature a couple of degrees. And over winter, it seems that females do drop their body temperature, but fairly minimally. And certainly, there is variation across the Ursidae in terms of the depth of hibernation. Black bears are quite dopey in the middle of their hibernating period. So my colleagues that study black bears, they have no qualms about digging out a black bear from her den and then going in there and drugging it and working on it. If you tried that on a polar bear or grizzly bear, you would do it once and probably never live to talk about it. So there are differences across the species, but some commonalities in terms of their physiology.
I guess sort of leading on from that, talking about dosing the bears, there's a question here about how do you actually estimate the anesthesia dose given the differences in body fat?
Yeah, it's fortunately we work with some really excellent drugs now. We use what's called Zolotil or Tilazol, and when I first started using catching bears, we used different drugs, and it was awful because the bears, if you sneezed, I mean, the threat for, if you want to threaten a polar bear, you want to play tough, you sort of chuff at them. You go, if you do that, that's a warning call. And when we use the drug, the bears, if somebody sneezed, it sounds like a warning call, and we would have bears getting up. You know, we'd have blindfolds on them, but they could overpower the drugs. Now the drugs we use are very robust to misestimation. You don't want to do that. But bears, we're drugging actually on the lean body mass, not the fat body mass. So the dosage actually doesn't change much because fat is so poorly vascularized. What we want to make sure is that we have an intramuscular injection. So we go for the large muscle masses. In the springtime, the rump is fine, but in the summer when they're very fat, we usually go for the shoulder or the neck, base of the neck, where we know we can get a intramuscular. So it's pretty straightforward. We have anywhere from basically about 4 milliliters up to about 8 milliliters, and that's the range. A really big male would actually probably take 2 darts of 7 milliliters to get it to be fully immobilized, whereas an adult female normally would go down with about 5 milliliters. So you basically just have to make sure that you're in the right ballpark, and then you can adjust with a top-up dose if you need to. But polar bears are incredibly cooperative. As I mentioned, I've worked on grizzly bears, and they are totally uncooperative. So you'd think for 2 so closely allied species in evolutionary time that they would behave the same, but it's actually, they're chalk and cheese. There's nothing about them that is the same. Polar bears gently walk away or trot away from a helicopter. A grizzly bear will stand on its hind legs and try to pull you out of the air, and then it will chase you. It will get behind the helicopter and run after it around, and polar bears will never do that. Polar bears never jump at helicopters. Grizzly bears almost always do. So, yeah.
Why do you think there are those behavioural changes? Do you think it's because the different amounts of interaction that they have with humans on a daily basis, or within their lifetimes?
If I was to speculate, I think it depends on where you evolved. Polar bears evolved out on the sea ice environment where there are no other predators, no other large carnivores. If we step back into the Pleistocene, we had a whole host of other really big bears. We had things like Arctodus in North America that would be almost as tall as I am at the shoulder. They were massively huge bears. We had dire wolves. We had all sorts of things that grizzly bears had to deal with, or brown bears had to deal with them. So I think that from a paleo perspective, the grizzly bear just learned that, sort of the best defense is really a good offense. And anybody comes near, you just scare them away, you bluff them off. And some other mammals still use that sort of approach. Honey badgers in Africa are notorious for doing that. Wolverine in North America are quite aggressive towards other predators. So I think that's what it is. But polar bears, they just got this totally zen attitude when they moved out onto the sea ice where there's not much competition, nobody to fight with, except other bears.
Makes them nicer to research, I guess, when you're interacting with them.
It does.
We've just got one more question here from Natalie about whether the pollutants that are seen in polar bears are also seen in ringed seals, and do you know if it's a result of bioaccumulation, or is it due to polar bears being forced to spend more time on the land where they potentially have more exposure to human life?
Yeah, no, I got forced into dealing with pollution when I started working at the Norwegian Polar Institute, because the bears there were incredibly high pollution levels, which we found in the late 90s. It's all marine sourced. It's all coming through bioaccumulation. And you have to remember that most of the pollutants that we're talking about, things like PCBs, they're polychlorinated biphenyls. Those are all lipophilic, so they bond to fat molecules. The polar bear diet is highly fat biased, so it's a perfect setup for bioaccumulation, top apex predator, accumulating very high levels of pollutants. By comparison, the levels of several of the compounds that we see in polar bears, if you were using mink, the mustelid, as your experimental animal, and if you put the level of pollution in a mink that we have in polar bears, they would either die or they would certainly stop reproducing. So polar bears are, for some reason, eminently well suited for dealing with these high levels of pollutants. But nonetheless, we believe they do have effects. We've documented effects on immune system, endocrine function, growth, bone structure, and suggestions of some individuals having reproductive effects. But on the plus side, PCBs as a compound are actually declining, although we still have increasing levels of pollutants. And we just did some exploratory chemical work with some analytical chemists, and they identified several hundred new pollutants in polar bears. And there's no standards. We don't actually know what they are, but we think they're chemical products coming out of industrializing and developing nations. So it's an ongoing concern, but sea ice loss is really our #1 issue for polar bears.
I guess, yeah, the pollutants is going to have to be something that's carefully monitored. As like you say, it's already is changing, and it'll probably continue to change which pollutants are actually affecting them. But we know that sea ice decreasing is an issue that's happening and will continue to happen.
There are some nasty interactions here. One of the things we see, and we've documented quite nicely, is the more that a bear depletes their fat stores, the higher the levels of the circulating pollutants. So the pollutants really are staying in their adipose tissue until they're pushed very far into their fasting period. So it's a concern because we get this spike in circulating pollutants as the bears lose body condition. And of course, the effects of climate change are exacerbating that. And you have to think that, you know, a female polar bear gives birth to a cub, and those cubs are about 500 grams at birth. And when are they born? Sort of midwinter, after the female has depleted a large portion of her fat reserves. And then she's going to nurse them in the den for another 2 months to 3 months, using this depleting fat reserve. And of course, the most polluted bears we have in the population are these really young cubs, because they pick up so much from their mothers through the milk transfer.
It's really heartbreaking to hear stuff like that.
We have a heavy footprint on this planet that we
have to. And I think we need to be more responsible. It's good that there's people like you that's doing this research and raising awareness so that people understand the importance, and I guess our moral obligation for looking after the planet better. I don't think we've got any more questions unless there's any last questions coming through. If there are no more questions, then I guess that just leaves me to say thank you again for that brilliant talk, and thank you everyone for joining today. And Merry Christmas, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day, depending on where you are. Thank you.
I'm back to work now. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. It's been my pleasure, and all the best for the happy holidays for you all.